So welcome back, everyone. Thank you for participating in our survey. You should be seeing the results coming up there. We'll be delving into these in more detail and taking them into consideration in due course. We're not going to unpack them now, because now I'd like to introduce you to the first of our speakers, and that is Craig Bennett, who's CEO of Wildlife Trust. Welcome, Craig.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. You've recently been to Glasgow to attend COP26, and it'd be great if you could share with us your thoughts, your recollections, your reflections of that meeting, and particularly what it might mean for nature. In the meantime, folks, members, you're welcome to put questions into the Q&A function, and we'll get through as many of those as we can at the end of the two presentations. But for now, over to you, Craig.
Great, Ian, thank you so much. And let me say, it's a real pleasure to be joining you at the Devon Wildlife Trust AGM today. Great to be able to join you. And really great to be able to talk about this, about what the Wildlife Trust were doing at COP26, what we made of it, and what it means for where we go next in our work in putting nature in recovery. I'm going to start, if I can, actually, by just sort of answering the question, well, why were we there? Why should we as the Wildlife Trust, be worried about climate change and feel that there's something we can do about it? Because I'm sure many of you sort of will get that, but I always find that, for some people it's not so clear. And actually, throughout my career, I've always been really frustrated with how the climate issue has been held up sometimes as something very separate from biodiversity and nature issues. They've been for too long, they've been treated as very, very different issues. But I would say they are inextricably linked. It's absolutely clear now from the science that we have no hope of solving the climate crisis unless we can put nature into recovery. We have no hope of putting nature into recovery unless we tackle the climate crisis. And actually, the two are so closely linked. That's the reason for it. People often wonder why, well, how are they linked? Burning of fossil fuels, what's that got to do with nature and so on, and actually worrying about my nature reserve down the end of the road, what's that got to do with climate? But, maybe the answer is staring us in the face much more clearly than we sometimes realize. And it is in that phrase, fossil fuels. Let's think about it. What is it? What's caused the problem of climate change? It is our burning of fossil fuels. And what are fossil fuels? They are dead, fossilized biodiversity. And it's a simple fact that we often forget. Over millions and millions of years, we moved from the warm periods into colder periods, the ice ages around the world, of course. And that happened naturally because of little wobbles in the Earth's rotation, things called Milankovitch cycles. I feel I've got to say that with Ian present to get into that. But Milankovitch cycles led to a little wobble in how the Earth moved around the sun and actually how it rotated around the sun. That wasn't enough to explain the shift from cold periods into warm periods. It triggered it off, but actually then when you had a big flux of carbon going from the biosphere into the atmosphere, or from the atmosphere back into the biosphere, that then explains the difference, a significant temperature difference between a cold period, an ice age, and a warm period, which is about 4 or 5 degrees on average difference between ice ages and the warm sort of periods we're in now. And of course, this current warm period, which has been going on for 10 to 15,000 years, has been stable enough that it led to the emergence of human civilization, the civilization we're in now, if you want to call it that, whatever we're in now anyway. And so actually it's so clearly linked. If it wasn't for nature, we wouldn't have had these changes. If it wasn't from carbon moving from the atmosphere into nature, into the biosphere, and from the biosphere back into the atmosphere of these years, we would have not had those moves from the ice ages in quite that way into the warmer periods that we get now. So it is very, very closely linked. And of course, when carbon moves from the atmosphere into nature, when you saw the huge flush of fish populations, for example, in the seas during the ice ages, and others, and in swamps and so on, and then those became fossilized, they get turned into fossil fuels. And then when we burn those fossil fuels again, we release that carbon back into the atmosphere. It's very, very clear how these are linked. Now, to stop runaway climate change, of course, we have to stop burning fossil fuels, and that's carbon that was drawn down from the atmosphere over millions of years. So even just putting nature into recovery won't be enough. We absolutely have to stop burning fossil fuels. But actually, even if we could wave a magic wand and stop burning fossil fuels tonight, carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are currently around 417 parts per million. That's still too high. We're already seeing some of the effects of climate change at that. And we do have to look at how later this century we can be drawing carbon down from the atmosphere, again, by putting nature in recovery. So these are very, very closely linked. And also we know that that nature is one of the best ways that we can adapt to extreme weather events. If actually we can restore our peat bogs, they can hold water back in the landscape. If we can restore our river communities and habitats along rivers, in and around our towns and cities as well, that will help protect us from some of the more extreme weather events. So the two are very closely linked, and it's been a huge frustration to me and many others over the years that they've been treated as separate issues. We have to look at them together, and that's really why it was so important for us as the Wildlife Trust to be at COP26 to put those points across. So what happened at COP26, and how do we judge it? How do we make sense of it? Well, these are enormous events, to give you an idea of it. They have something like 30, 40,000 people at them. They are quite extraordinary kind of gatherings where the world comes together to try and talk about how to tackle climate change. To give you just a flavour of it, some things that a lot of people don't realise, you might think it's like an ordinary conference. It's absolutely not. To get in, of course, you have to have all your security for this one as well. We had to have daily COVID tests to get into what's called the blue zone, where the negotiations were taking place, and prove that we were negative for COVID, of course. But the thing you might not realise is that after you've gone through all the security, and you go through, and there's 3 levels of security to get inside. When you go through that final level, we were no longer technically in Scotland. We were actually in UN territory for that period of time, and UN laws applied as opposed to Scottish law applied. That really gives you a sense of a flavour of what these areas are like. And ironically, you know, it's over this huge venue, which was actually several buildings, you know, a conference centre in its own right, a stadium in its own right, and another exhibit space in its own right, and temporary buildings all kind of connected together. As I said, it was UN territory for that duration. But I mean, the scale of it was absolutely enormous. And ironically, it feels like you're kind of trapped in an airport for a day. Well, rather ironic given the issues, but that's kind of what it feels like for 2 weeks, just wandering around this airport with all the kind of nations of the world there, and all the governments there. There's a particular room, I call it a room, it's more like a huge warehouse, and not, again, like almost like a airport hangar, actually, where you have all the governments of the world lined up, almost 200 governments. They're all in their own little sheds. They're given a little shed, literally a shed, and they're put around in alphabetical order. So, you know, you pass one shed and you've got Cameroon in there, and then you've got Canada in the next one, you've got China in the next one. And it's quite extraordinary to see the world coming together to try and, however imperfectly, to try and deal with this crisis. But how do we judge it? How do we judge the success of it? And I'll be honest with you, you know, I always find it really agonizing to try and give a verdict at the end of any COP, climate COP, because of course you can always, even if it's made some steps forward, or even if it's made some progress, it's never enough to deal with the scale of the climate emergency. And you've got to tell the truth about that. But equally, what we don't want to say is it was a waste of time, because it's not a waste of time. It's actually really important that we work together in this. What we should do is recognise it's not the only game in town, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But nonetheless, I think it is an important process, and we're finally starting to see a few baby steps forward. Yes, we need to see giant strides, but we're starting to see a few baby steps forward. But over the years, I've come to sort of think that there's actually, at any one time, there's 3 COPs going on, and that's the way to understand it. So there's one COP, which is about the narrative, and you could just call it the rhetoric. It's where all the political leaders turn up and they compete with each other about how strongly they can say they care about the planet and they want to save the planet. It's very easy to dismiss that. It's very easy for us to say, you know, what a waste of time, and are they just trying to prove themselves in their rhetoric? And because, of course, so often the delivery of what those leaders are doing does not live up to the scale of rhetoric. But I still think it actually really matters, because when you have the world leaders all lining up to talk about how this is a crisis, how we've got to keep temperature rises at no higher than 1.5 degrees, how we've got to treat this as a matter of urgency, and we've got to scale up our response on climate change. And indeed, that nature is part of the answer. Actually, the world hears that. The investment markets hear it, business hears it, communities hear it, and it starts to kind of shift the dial slowly but surely on the outcomes. And often what I've noticed is when politicians ramp up the rhetoric, funny enough, it might not make a difference to the formal outcome of that particular COP, but it helps make a difference to the formal outcome 2 or 3 COPs down the line. So it does kind of matter. And what was interesting this time around, what was absolutely clear, is pretty much all the world leaders lined up and said we've got to keep temperature rises to just 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That's not happened before. You've got to bear in mind that even at the Paris climate talks in 2015, the leaders were talking about 2 degrees rather than 1.5 degrees. The difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is whether coral reefs survive or not, for example. That absolutely is very clear in the science. Coral reefs are basically gone at 2 degrees. We might just be able to keep them at 1.5 degrees. And it's true for so many other aspects in the natural environment as well, true for many other habitats, and quite possibly even potentially for some of our peat bogs, for example, in this country. It makes quite a big difference. The other thing that happened in that rhetoric is more than I've ever seen before. The world leaders were talking about the role of nature and just how important it is, and how if we can put nature in recovery. And in fact, some of them even talked about 30 by 30, getting 30% of our land and sea in recovery by 2030, that can make a difference. And finally, the other thing that happens is some of those sort of G7 world leaders, Boris Johnson, President Biden, Emmanuel Macron, they have to sit down and listen to, for example, the Prime Minister of Barbados, when she actually says directly to them and looks at them in the face about how her country might not exist unless we cut emissions in the rich countries faster. And I think that's a very powerful outcome from that. At the second level, the second kind of COP that goes on is all the kind of bilateral, multilateral agreements that happen outside the formal COP process, but nonetheless can be quite significant. So of course there was the agreement between the US and China that happened at COP26, which I think was really pretty significant in its way. I mean, it doesn't have the details in it that we would like to have, but you do have US and China committing to work together this decade to bring down emissions rapidly this decade, and to look at how they can do that. And given they're the 2 biggest polluters, and given the difficult geopolitics between US and China at the moment, I think it is significant that it will coming together on this issue. But you also saw multilateral agreements on coal, you had multilateral agreements on methane, multilateral agreements on cars, and those are partnerships between governments and car makers, for example, and others on trying to end the sale of petrol and diesel cars globally. That's very significant. For each of these, you can look at it and think, well, some countries are part of that agreement and other key ones are not. And, that's right. They're not as strong as we would like them to be. But all of them, I think, will shift the investment markets and shift the reality on the ground about what's happening in response to this. You also saw even the Beyond Oil and Gas Coalition, which was led by Costa Rica and Denmark, which said we should set a date to stop exploring for oil and gas. Really, I think that will prove to be quite significant over time. And I think one of the roles that we can play at the Wildlife Trusts is put pressure on the UK eventually to sign up to that, we would hope. So you also saw, of course, the huge agreement on forests, a pledge to end deforestation by 2030. And it did have countries like Brazil signed up to it, which I think was very significant. And there was new finance on the table to make that happen. Now, with all of these agreements, the devil will be in the detail and, of course, the delivery. But nonetheless, it is useful to have those kind of agreements working at that tier, what I call almost like the second COP. And then the third COP is where you have the formal text. You have all these debates over the text and the formal process that has to involve all 196 countries. It moves painfully slowly. My goodness, it's frustrating just how slowly it moves. And sometimes I want to pull my hair out about how slowly that moves. But of course, it moves slowly because it is a consensus way of working between 196 countries trying to work together on this. And, we can tell 2 stories there. If you look at those nationally determined contributions, countries coming forward and pledging the cuts they're going to make in their carbon dioxide emissions, when you add those up at the moment, it still looks like we're on track to look at 2.4 degrees, something like that, of warming as things stand at the moment. And that would still be catastrophic. But I said we can tell two stories there. I can remember just 10 years ago, we were looking at 6 degrees of warming. When you look at what countries are planning to do. Now at 2.4, it's definitely moving in the right direction. There's a lot more to do. The countries have promised to come back next year and try and commit further efforts to get closer to 1.5 degrees. And we're going to absolutely need that and hold them to account on that. And every government is going to have to do more on this agenda. And, you know, it's one of those times where you can say this is a disaster, it's not nearly good enough, or you can say we're making pretty good progress, depending which way you look at it. Both of those narratives are simultaneously true, I would say. And you also saw commitments, for example, in that text, again, to look at how we can restore nature as part of solving the climate crisis, both in terms of mitigation and in terms of adaptation as well. So you saw that coming through, and that I think will over time kind of make a difference. Whether it will be fast enough depends on what happens next, not so much what happened in Glasgow, but we do see that painful progress. So in conclusion, what we said as the Wildlife Trust, and we are always trying to find a snappy way of summarising what is a very complicated story, is we said what you saw in Glasgow was baby steps forward when we needed giant strides forward. But it was baby steps, at least we saw that, and we saw that moving forward, which is really welcome. But what that all means, what's really critical, is we cannot rely on these big international processes to be the silver bullet that will solve this. They won't be, they never will be. They're just the kind of ratcheting up, if you like, of what the bottom bar is on climate action. And actually, they only move as fast as governments around the world allow them to move, and governments only move as fast as local communities and their voters allow them to move. Which is why, if we want to see faster action in the UN climate talks, if we want to see faster action at a national level on tackling the climate ecological emergency here in the UK, the only way forward on that is to build that public pressure at a local community level and actually make sure that leadership is coming from local communities on, yes, stopping burning fossil fuels, but also on putting nature into recovery, both to help mitigate, but also to adapt to the climate change we have locked in. And when you see like the huge leadership we've seen, say from Devon Wildlife Trust, in for example, reintroducing beavers and making sure that beavers are seen in our landscape again. You know, we often hear that beavers are ecosystem engineers. That's absolutely right. But I would say beavers are #1 wonderful ambassadors for climate adaptation. Earlier this year, the UK government published a report looking at the UK climate risk assessment. And a big, long report, 1,000 pages long. The lead author is now working for the Wildlife Trust as our Director of Climate Action. So we poached a good person there. I'm very pleased to say she was formerly working for the Committee on Climate Change. She's now with us at the Wildlife Trust. But this 1,000-page report looking at the impact of climate in the UK, which amongst other things is saying represent the biggest threat to nature in the decades ahead, also said what we've got to do to prepare for climate change, to adapt to climate change. Lots of things, but the top line level is hold water back in the landscape, both to make sure our ecosystems have the water they need, but also to reduce extreme flood events and so on. And we all know which particular wonderful fluffy animal is very good at holding water back into the landscape. And we know that Devon Wildlife Trust has been at the forefront of making sure we have these marvellous animals, beavers, back in our landscape. And of course, you'll probably know that there's a consultation with DEFRA right now as to whether we can allow beavers to roam free right across England in the future. Fingers crossed, we're pretty confident that in the new year, DEFRA will tell the Wildlife Trust that beavers can be reintroduced into the wild right across England and Wales, and that will be enormously powerful and I think a real symbol of how we can bring wildlife back. So thank you very much. I hope that's been useful. I know we're going to get into some questions and answers, and very happy to take any questions or comments you have. Thanks. Back to you, Ian.
Thanks, Craig. And we have got some questions coming in. We'll take them after Harry's one, and I don't want to spend too much time blabbing on. I mean, it was my first COP of this one, and so it was interesting hearing your reflections there, because they're pretty much exactly as me. And I was talking to a lot of people because it was my first COP. What is this like? And this idea of multiple COPs going on parallel was something that I, gradually realized about. And I was in that big warehouse room, seeing the ministers and big people talking about that. And then you've got the green zone where there's lots of interesting things, but also that pavilions where it's kind of like a big marketing job a lot of the time. There were a lot of, you could call it greenwashing, but certainly selling what people were doing. And it was almost like a trade fair, which was slightly disconcerting. And then, of course, in the streets, tons of stuff happening on the streets. And one of the things that struck me was the difference between the blunt, simplistic rhetoric on the streets and the complicated, convoluted political discussions going on. And I didn't at times know how those two integrated. I mean, what it seems to me is that action on the streets gives the political people the courage to make those difficult decisions. Is that the way that you see it? Because it was quite hard to just fit those two narratives together. They didn't seem to fit together.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It makes a huge difference. I mean, we had lots of negotiators say to us directly, negotiators that have got into the process recently and ones that have been at it for 20 years have said all that pressure out in the streets makes a tremendous difference. The progress that has been made on this agenda would only have been possible with that kind of pressure out on the streets. So it's incredibly important. It is really difficult when it comes down to it to get 196, 197 sometimes countries to agree on a kind of a way forward there. But and I could again talk about how frustratingly slowly we're moving compared to what the urgency that's needed on this issue. But actually, if you compare it to most other sort of multilateral agreements, it's actually, believe it or not, moving quite fast. It's only because of the issue that we're working on here is just so urgent that, of course, it seems like it's taking such a long time.
Well, it was interesting. I had a session on the Monday convened on climate adaptation. And on the panel was Salim Huq, who from Bangladesh. And he had been to every single COP. And I said to him, what is it, that you probably, it must just like this, like a Groundhog Day coming back to the same, you probably forget what country you're in. It's the same type of building. What is it that brings you back? And he said, because every year we make progress. Every year we move forward. And I think that's the thing. It's the pace of the movement that I think is frustrating people. But what is important, I think, your point exactly, COP in Paris, it was a real surprise that 1.5 came up as so prominent because we'd kind of almost given up on it. And here we are, 5 years down or even more down the line, and 1.5 is still theoretically possible. So I think that's fantastic. It was great. I hadn't quite realized that stuff about the UN zone. They still had loads of Tunnock's chocolate bars and iron brew in the national area. So that's good. I think I'm going to press on just because make sure we get a little bit of time. I know you're pressed for time later on. So let's move on to Harry, and then we'll keep some questions and we'll come back to you, Craig, later on, if that's okay. So Harry, can we move on to Harry? Harry, we're going to talk about the future plans of the trust, and then we'll take joint questions for everyone. But over to you, Harry.
Great, thank you very much, Ian. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Yes, you can see my screen. That's brilliant. Well, that's a really, really inspiring report of what's happened at COP26. And it's a great springboard for what I want to talk about, because I want to talk about our new strategy. This is a 10-year strategy. And we have decided to set this strategy on the basis of the challenge that needs to be met, not on the basis of what Devon Wildlife Trust feels it can deliver with its resources now. So it's a big, bold, ambitious strategy, but exciting nonetheless. Now, some of you might be wondering why we want a new strategy. I'm hoping the next slide will come up in a second. Hopefully you can see that. If you can see that, you will see a picture of a graph, and it looks slightly alarmingly like a map or a chart rather of temperature rises across the globe. But what it's actually showing is the increase in support for the natural world among the public in recent years. So you can see back in, so I can see it's coming up now. Sorry about the delay. It was actually quite high in the late noughties, and then we had the big financial crash, and it plummeted down, and you see it flatline for several years. Bit of a blip around those big floods in 2014, but it really didn't amount to very much. And then you can see in 2018, suddenly it starts to creep up. A little bit of a drop at the beginning of COVID, but it is now at a historic all-time high. And so we looked at that and we thought, well, look, 3-4 years ago, we were talking about the green, well, we weren't, but politicians were talking about the green blob, how the environment was standing in the way of progress in the economy. And now that's all changed. The environment is front and center stage. And because of that, we need to up our game and we need to represent ourselves and our mission. We need a new 10-year strategy. And that's why we've gone for a new 10-year strategy. Now, the slide that hopefully will be coming up in a second now, subject to delays, is about our vision. Oh, here it is. So every strategy has a vision, doesn't it? And I could spend a while talking through some fancy text. I'm not going to do that. I hope I can paint a picture just with a few simple statements here. There are a number on the slide. I'm just going to pick up 3 of them. So nature is everywhere. Now, for too long, we thought of nature as being somewhere that should be in nature reserves. And of course, it can't just be in nature reserves. We need it in our homes, in our gardens, in industrial estates, in the middle of cities, everywhere, across farmland. We need nature everywhere. Wildlife is abundant. Now, an organisation like Devon Wildlife Trust, and indeed all wildlife trusts, we spend a lot of time thinking about the rare birds, the rare insects, the narrow-headed ants, which we've got on one site in the whole of England now, in Chudley Nut and Heath Nature Reserve, and things like that, and new species we're introducing, and that's incredibly important. But we mustn't forget the common abundance, or once much more common stuff. That's so important. That's how most people interact with wildlife. The large flocks of starlings, the clouds or former clouds of red admiral butterflies, things like that. So wildlife abundant as well as everywhere. That's critical. And the third statement I just want to pick out is this thing of nature is normal. And so many of us love nature, but we might watch it on a David Attenborough program. We might go for a walk in the woods over the weekend. Nature has got to be central to every decision we make throughout society. It needs to be there in every political decision, in every business decision. It needs to be as normal as me thinking about health and safety, or strapping my seatbelt on when I get into the car. Absolutely critical. So this is the vision we want to paint for wildlife in Devon. Now, the next slide, which hopefully will come up in a second, is about the crisis. Here it is, the crises that we are facing. So we've built our strategy around 3 crises. Now, 2 of these should be very familiar, I think, to all of us. One we've just been talking about with Craig and Ian, that's the climate crisis. The second, equally familiar, the ecological crisis. But there, in my view, is a third one, which I think underpins both of those. And this is a crisis of disconnect with the natural world. And when I say a crisis of disconnect, I don't mean that people out there don't care about the environment. Of course we know they do, more than ever before. But our relationship with the natural environment has changed. We see it on telly, we hear about it, we buy food in supermarkets. A few centuries ago, many more people worked the land. Our interaction with nature was much more, much closer and much more direct. And I think because of that separation, we've rather lost that sense of the impact of what we do when we buy, when we purchase, and when we take our day-to-day decisions. So that is the third critical thing that we need to build our strategy on. So, like all strategies, we have a number of goals, and hopefully a slide will be coming up soon showing some goals. So the first 2 of these are about bringing nature back, bringing wildlife back. You've heard me say this a number of times. We need more sites, bigger sites, better quality sites, because we're not looking after a lot of them as well as we should, and we need them to be more connected. And as Sue Goodfellow said earlier on, we need 30% at least of our land and seas to be protected for wildlife. Wildlife won't come back overnight. It takes a while. So we're using the phrase wildlife in recovery. Now, we've split this crucial element of our strategy into 2 separate goals. That was a very conscious decision, one on land and one on sea. And the reason for this is because in a county like Devon, where at least half our wildlife is out in the seas, we've got 2 coasts, the only English county with 2 coasts, we really need to up our game on marine. So this was a very conscious decision to have marine as a separate goal. Now, moving on to our next 2 goals, goals 3 and 4. So goal 3, this is nature-based solutions. never quite sure about the phrase here, but it's a phrase that everyone's using, and what it means is what matters. So nature does so many things for us. We know it sequesters carbon so effectively. Craig has just been talking about that very eloquently. We know it slows the flow of water, it purifies water. We know it does so much in terms of purifying our air and managing air quality. And as crucial as any of them, it is absolutely vital for our health, our well-being, our state of mind. So we need a goal around that. And our final goal, this is really dealing with that third crisis I mentioned a minute ago. We want 1/4 of Devon's population actively engaged in wildlife. And those are the two key words, actively engaged. And I can tell you that's an order of magnitude more than what we've got at the moment. That's a real challenge. But achieve that, we must, if we're going to get on top of these crises we're facing. Now, about a year ago, we asked you, we started working on the strategy, and we asked you your opinions on what we were doing. And I'm hoping a slide will appear very shortly showing, so yes, here it is. And we asked you a number of questions, and this was the answer to one of the questions. So this particular question asked you what you thought was the most important thing we should be doing. And hundreds of you answered, which was brilliant. And you won't be able to see all the text here. I'm not going to try reading it all out, but I'll pick out the top 3. So, working with farmers and land managers to improve wildlife, flood risk and soils. That is absolutely core to that goal 3. And you'll be pleased to know, because this is the runaway winner, that's the bottom from 1, that grey bar there. And that actually is the single biggest area of work we do at Devon Wildlife Trust. So I'm multiple relieved about that, I can tell you. The second one, protecting the environment from built development. Absolutely, this is core goal 1 stuff. Gets back to one of the questions asked earlier on at the AGM. Are we doing enough on this? We can never be doing enough on this. And yes, we need to be doing more. Absolutely critical. And the third one, this cuts across several goals, eliminating pollution from our rivers, our waterways and our seas. Yes, of course, we must. One of the things we put in our strategy is a multi-sector plan to deal with marine pollution. Come on to that in a minute. So thank you so much for that feedback, been really useful, and we've incorporated that into the strategy. Now, strategies, often strategies are goals, aspirations, lots of fine words, visions, all that stuff. And of course that's important, but what we really need to make a strategy work is some hard stuff that we can hold ourselves accountable for. And we have populated our strategy with 40 of these, in fact. And I'm just going to pick up a few, and I'm hoping a slide will come up quite shortly that you can see. Yes, here it is. So we want to bring nature back on a grand scale. We want to create 10,000 hectares of rewilded land. Now, when I say rewilded, I don't mean buying an enormous area of land, putting a fence around it, shooing everyone off and releasing a bunch of wolves. That is not what I mean by rewilding. This is rewilding as a journey, and it's rewilding with people involved. That's absolutely critical. And this journey is land becoming more natural, more driven by natural processes, and at the same time, more wildlife rich. Now, we're looking at various landscapes. We're looking at them in the north of Devon, we're looking at them in the east of Devon, and we're looking at them here, places like this on Dartmoor. And the key thing here is to try and find landscapes where we've got quite good connectivity already, but there are a few key missing pieces in the jigsaw. And if we can put those missing pieces back, whether it's Devon Wildlife Trust only or someone else, then we can get this really great connectivity. So very excited about that. Now, the second one I wanted to pick out was about marine. I can see the slides come out. Now, we've been doing a lot of work to try and create marine conservation zones, and we did a lot better, to be honest, than we thought we would a few years ago. We need more, though. At the moment, our marine conservation zones protect, with varying degrees of success, these seafloor habitats, so the dual anemones, the pink sea fans, etc. What they don't protect is what we have in the water column. And the water column, we don't just have fish, we have these wonderful charismatic megafauna. We have very many species of dolphins, whales, harbour porpoise, we have basking shark, and we need them protected too. So we are pushing, giving ourselves a target of at least 1,000 square kilometres of sea that is protected for these wonderful beasts. And even these protections aren't enough. We need areas where there is no human interference at all. And we want to push for at least 10% of our seas around Devon to be these highly protected marine areas or no-take zones. 10% may not sound very much, but I can tell you that's quite ambitious. Really excited about that. Now, this next slide is a little bit of a fraud, if I'm honest, because it's not in Devon at all. It's about as far away as you can get from Devon in England, and this is in Norfolk. This is a place called Wild Ken Hill, which Craig and I and some other people were lucky enough to visit quite recently. Now, this is not, there's nothing hippie about this farm at all. This is a very productive, very innovative, very modern, very high-tech farm. But there are some special things about this farm. The soil is never left bare. You normally see more than one crop in the field at any one time. There is no use of artificial fertilizer. There is no use whatsoever of pesticide, but it's still a highly effective and efficient farm. This is the kind of farming of the future. If we've got 30% of land for wildlife, we've still got 70% that we need to manage well, whether it's for cities or for farms. In this case, for farms. Most of our land, of course, is going to be farmed. But we need it to be this kind of farming. And so we're setting ourselves a target of rolling this kind of thing right out across Devon. Extremely important and extremely exciting. And of course, I mentioned cities just back there. It's not just about managing our land effectively and in a green, sustainable way on the farmland. It's so important to do this in cities too. Now, the slide that's about to appear, I hope, is in China. And this is called Sponge Cities. I just love this idea. It's the brainchild of an amazing Chinese architect whose name I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, but he's brilliant. And what you don't see in this picture is just around the corner is the Yangtze, the third biggest river in the world. And the Yangtze at this point is very canalized, full of concrete, and it's very, very good at controlling the river in sort of normal conditions. Absolutely hopeless at controlling it when there's an awful lot of rain upstream in the Himalayas, because it all comes shooting down, floods over the city. So the idea of sponge cities is that you create an area which soaks up the water, holds it in a time of drought and releases it steadily. And as well as that, wonderful carbon sink. And just look at this beautiful environment that it's creating for the people of this Chinese city. So then, another thing I wanted to pick up, wilder status. Now, wilder status for our towns and villages across Devon. This is relating to Goal 4. Now, this relates to a question that I answered earlier on. But for a long time, Devon Wildlife Trust and other wildlife trusts, we've been taking our show out to schools and villages and universities and things like that, and inspiring a lot of people. And that's great work, and we don't want to stop it. But we're never, and even if we had an army of sort of 500 people doing this at Devon Wildlife Trust, we'd never have enough to get to all the communities out there. And nor should we, because actually we want the communities to be leading this. So the idea of wilder status, I haven't got time to talk through exactly what it means in detail, but basically it means that communities can agree to do certain actions of their choosing. It might be sowing wildflower meadows, it might be clearing up litter, it might be planting trees, it might be turning the whole group, the whole village into renewable energy and solar powered homes, anything like that. But the idea of this is that this green revolution of the right sort, I'm not talking about agricultural green revolution, but this other kind of green revolution, carbon neutral revolution, let's call it, is led very much by the communities, with us facilitating, not ourselves or other NGOs just trying to push it onto people. Now, what I talked about so far is very much about things that we're trying to do to advance our mission, but equally important is, what about the Devon Wildlife Trust? Because the strategy also needs to be saying what we as an organisation are all about. And we have plenty of challenges. And we've set ourselves a number of goals, four goals about how we do things internally. And the first one I just want to talk about briefly is about walking the talk, and it's about setting our own standards. So there are a number of things we need to do here. We need to totally eliminate pesticides. We want to do that from all of our activities. And we want to go carbon neutral as soon as possible. And by 2030 at the absolute latest. Now, you might think that our challenge there is all about getting rid of, stopping our roofs leaking and getting rid of petrol cars and things like that. And of course, that's important. But actually, the biggest challenge we have is this. By far, it's the grazing on our reserves. And these wonderful stripy beasts, these actually aren't ours, they belong to the National Trust, but they're lovely beasts. And they do such a great job of managing nature reserves, but they also emit a lot of carbon through methane and other routes. And this is a big problem for us. because you can't just stop grazing the nature reserves. We're here to look after wildlife. So we're doing a lot of work to try and tackle this puzzle, look at how we can manage our nature reserves a bit differently, look at how we can cut those carbon emissions. So that's a big challenge for us. And we need to get there, because who are we to tell other people to go carbon neutral if we can't even do it ourselves? Now, another thing we need to try and do is look at who comes to the Devon Wildlife Trust. Now, the slide that's going to appear in a second is a lovely slide, but I have to say it's quite a rare sight for a rural county like Devon. And this relates to one of Alan Ramage's excellent questions earlier on at the AGM. We are in danger as a sector of being much too focused on certain groups. And we spend a lot of time, quite rightly, talking about gender, talking about race, talking about age, talking about disability, LGBTQ+, and all these things. And absolutely so we should. But the biggest challenge we have of all, in my view, is actually not any of them. It's the yawning gap in the socioeconomic breakdown of this country. And it is absolutely critical that we are welcoming to people right the way across that spectrum, not just one part of it. That is, in my view, is the single biggest challenge we have with this whole EDI thing. And underlying all of this, we've got to be an organisation that people want to work for, want to govern by being a trustee, or want to volunteer for. That's absolutely critical. So we've got to be high performing. We've got to know how to manage our money and raise our money. We've got to have proper systems. We've got to be a good employer. Now, at the moment, I think we're good, but good is not enough. We need to be great. So we're setting ourselves a whole load of targets to get from good to great, which is going to be absolutely critical. And I'm very excited about that. And of course, we're not quite finally, but almost finally, we are part of a national movement. We have to remember that. It's so great to hear Craig talking about COP26 and all the involvement we've had in there. And since, Craig, you've joined, and some of the other people you've managed to pinch very cleverly from Climate Change Committee and others, I think we've seen a real gearing up of the Wildlife Trust and the movement, and the Wildlife Trust really getting on the top table. And that's just so encouraging for all of us at a local level. And documents like this, so nature-based solutions, explain to MPs how wildlife can provide such an important role in tackling carbon emissions. There's another really good document that's just come out about we're greening up our planning system, which of course we're very worried about. So we can slap these comments, these documents down on ministers' desks, or if necessary across their heads, and hopefully encourage them to change. And working all together as a movement, we have so much more of an opportunity to do that. So this national federation thing is absolutely critical in the strategy too. And finally, I would just say our work is never done. It would be lovely to think that we can turn around the world by 2030. We won't, of course. We will make progress. But just to add to something Craig said earlier on, I think it's so critical that we don't get downhearted by things like COP26 when they don't have the outcomes we want. They're never going to be as ambitious as we want them to be. But actually, this is things like COP, I think, it's like day-to-day life. You have great moments of elation, you have great disappointments. But actually, the progress that is made, either through tackling climate change or in wildlife, is that slow, incremental, consistent change across the landscape, which gradually is turning fields and valleys from a sort of a rather brown colour to a much more lovely green, multicoloured colour. That's what we want to see, and that is down to the grit, the determination, and the commitment and the desire to do good of everyone who's part of this movement. So look, let's keep our spirits up. Let's not be downhearted about COP. Let's keep fighting the good fight and really struggling to get together, striving, I should say, not struggling, striving for what we know is right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Harry. Fantastic. I'm very conscious that Craig has got a hard stop in just a few minutes. So I want to just, there's a couple of questions come in about for Craig about COP26. So Craig, one from Mike Moser says, a great take on COP26. How do you think the big players in the corporate and finance sectors are responding to this? Are they behind or ahead of governments? Are we pushing them enough? So the money people.
Yeah, great question. I don't think we can necessarily, it's always dangerous to generalize. We often, all, myself included, fall into trap about talking about business as if it's one big amorphous mass. But I mean, what you can find is fantastic leadership, fantastic efforts in the business community, and real laggards as well, real dinosaurs on this agenda. You absolutely have both. I think what I would say is now more than ever, you are seeing a big chunk of the business community getting behind this agenda. actually being ahead of where government's at, and the remainder actually being pushed to take this seriously, almost whether they believe in it or not. I mean, for example, the things that I watched very closely after COP26 to try and figure out, has it nudged us in the right direction or not, is what, for example, happened to the EU carbon price under the EU emission trading scheme. The Monday after COP26 finished, and it doesn't matter whether you believe in emissions trading or not, whether you think it's a good idea, a bad idea, or whatever, nonetheless, carbon prices rose very significantly on that Monday after the COP26 closed and reached the highest level they've ever reached, double what they were at the start of the year. Similarly, the cost of lending for fossil fuel projects increased a great deal last week as well. So I think, you know, all the financial signals are pointing in the right direction. There was all that debate at the end of COP26 about whether we would phase down or phase out coal. And, you know, we would have all preferred phase out rather than phase down. But I think in practice, I think if you're an investor, you'd be pretty mad at the moment because you'd be thinking you want to invest in new coal. So I think that's what will make the difference.
Yeah, and I think just on that, I mean, also, although there's plenty of greenwashing out there, there's also, you know, that's almost the first step that companies have to do to move down that journey, and you can definitely see them moving there. A question from Chris Davis says, what do you think that should be DWT's priorities? Should it be to, what do you think should be DWT's priorities should be to recover nature? I guess that should DWT's priorities be in recovering nature?
Is that
Shall I take that one?
Yeah.
Well, it's addressed to Craig, so I guess.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll be quiet.
Sorry, I guess it's an outsider's views on what DWT's priorities should be. Maybe that's a politically difficult question for you to do, Chris.
I hope, Harry, I will give the right answer. Look, I think you know, Harry and Devon Wildlife Trust have been at the forefront of really showing the leadership and the strategy that we've now been developing across the wildlife trusts nationwide, as it were. And there's that real focus on us trying to get, at least as Harry says, 30 by 30, to get 30% of our land and sea into recovery by 2030. That's all about delivering a big, better, more joined up nature conservation and nature recovery, getting our ecosystems and natural processes working again. You know, we've seen that with the work that Devon Wildlife Trust has done on beavers, for example. That's just one example. It's about that focus on natural processes rather than just individual species, always very important, of course, but actually making sure that we really see the ecology coming back and seeing those natural processes flourishing. But as Harry said, we shouldn't forget the sea either. You know, it's so important. We need to put more emphasis on a marine environment because that, you know, some people often say that's where half the biodiversity in the UK is located.
And I know you're going to have to go in a few minutes, but if you can start with this one, and then maybe we can switch it across to Harry. It's from Charles Sinclair. He says, I was disappointed not to hear any details from the UK government about nature-led recovery. Can you give any details about how their 30% from nature by 2030 might play out? Is this a big win for nature or a greenwash?
Well, as ever, it can be all of these things all at the same time. I seem to say that about everything these days. The UK government has committed to 30 by 30, and that was after we and others put quite a lot of pressure on them to do so. Unfortunately, at the moment, the way they interpret it, you could call kind of greenwash. What they've been saying is that they're counting all designated areas, including national parks and ANOBs and so on, as if they're perfect currently for nature. But we know, don't we, that in many cases, you know, of course, national park and ANOB designations are not primarily nature designations. In some cases, our wildlife is in a worse state inside our national parks than outside them. So if we could, you know, improve the sort of designation and the duties on those authorities to make sure that they are absolutely managing those areas, you know, primarily for nature, or indeed, if we can create more spaces for nature in addition to that outside of those areas, then I think we can truly see 30 by 30 being delivered. And that will probably be a bit of a debate, a discussion and a dance the Wildlife Trust will be doing with government over the years ahead as we push them to take a more rigorous assessment of that. But I think, you know, all these things are happening at the same time. I think there are people in government that are sincere about this. There are others that pay lip service to it. We are seeing progress in some areas and not enough in others. That's why we've just got to keep pushing.
Fantastic. And Harry, do you want to come in on that in terms of your take on it?
Well, I think Craig's covered it really, really well. I think when you look at the government at the moment, I'd say they've got my take, and I know much less about this than Craig because I'm not so close to it, but I think they seem to be very keen on new shiny stuff, species reintroductions, big new landscape designations, things like that. But actually, where I think we're really falling down at the moment, it's the monitoring, it's the enforcement of what we've already got. It's dealing with things like the quality of land. So you look at somewhere like, a lot of the uplands, so Dartmoor is one example, but there are much, much more problematic areas in our uplands than Dartmoor, where a huge, vast area might be a triple SI and the whole thing is failing. And the reasons behind that are not being tackled. So I think, it's very much a curate's egg. It depends which bits you look at. But I would say I think it's an awful lot better than it was 5 years ago.
Fantastic. Craig, I know you've got to rush off and get a train. So I think we should say goodbye. We'll carry on with Harry. But thanks very much.
Thanks so much for having me. And I just want to say it was fantastic. I did a flying visit to Devon Wildlife Trust a month or so back. Absolutely loved it. It was brilliant work going on in your wildlife trust, and I can't wait for the opportunity to come back. So thank you very much. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks. And we will continue. I've got a question that's actually come in from Simon Bates, and it's actually directed towards Craig. So I apologise that we've just missed it, Simon. But I think if Harry can pick it up, really. It says, should the Wildlife Trust use carbon credit money, for example, the woodland carbon units, to help fund expansion of tree cover? So what is the kind of policy area around that in terms of the Wildlife Trusts?
Oh, Simon, that's a very good question. And I'm rather wishing Craig was still here with us, but I'll have a go. I mean, I think the short answer is it's very, very complicated, and we need to think very carefully about how we do it. So we're taking the view that we shouldn't say a blanket no, and we definitely shouldn't say a blanket yes, but we should think very, very carefully about where we say yes and how we say yes. Because there is an awful lot of roguish behaviour out there. There is quite a bit of false accounting. There are some good people as well doing it the right way. So we have to be absolutely white and white. We've looked at schemes within the Wildlife Trust movement at doing this, and it's very, very complicated. It's very easy to see holes in them. So I don't think we have can't really stand too much on our high horse and say, no, we're not going to look at that. We're not going to look at that. Offsets, biodiversity, again, not going to look at any of these things. We do have to look at them because we have to take seriously any possible mechanism, but we've got to make sure that it is absolutely free of greenwash and is being done properly.
Thanks. And I think, Harry, this is for you. So it's from Richard Clack, and he says, how is collaboration with major landowners or other conservation charities progressing in order to deliver the green revolution at the necessary scale?
Oh, thank you very much, Richard. Well, the answer is it's progressing very well. So I think in Devon, we actually do more work one-to-one with landowners than any other wildlife trust. We've got a big team, I mentioned before. It's actually the biggest team we've got and has been throughout my entire 10 years that I've been at Devon Wildlife Trust. Now, most of the landowners we deal with are actually small. We tend to, and Devon has, I think, probably Devon and Cornwall, one of them have got on average, the smallest average farm size of any English county. So we have an awful lot of very small farmers, but it tends to be those that we deal with the most. Where I think we need to make a bit more progress is with some of the bigger states, with some of the much larger, perhaps more commercial farms. But I think what's happening now is you're seeing a lot of change in the technology as well as the thinking. I don't know if any of you have managed to read the Henry Dimbleby report, the Food Strategy Review. Now, I don't often recommend a government policy document as a good read when you go away on a holiday, but I would make an exception with this one. I was absolutely spellbound by it. I thought there was so much good stuff in there, and it really makes the case for how there's this massive change happening in farming. And it's not about going back to the Middle Ages or being, or as some might say, cynically tree hugging. It's not that at all. It's very much forward thinking, but it's really green, really encouraging. And I think that's the way to get to some of these bigger, more commercial farmers, because we absolutely have to do so.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think there are other questions out there that we've not managed to get to. I know we're going to try to respond to those outside of this, but I think we're right on time. So if I can pass over to you, Harry, and we'll wrap up that session. But over to you, Harry.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Ian. And you've been sharing this brilliantly right the way from Jordan. So we have people on this call today who are in at least 3 different countries and 2 different continents. So if there are a few delays, then please forgive us. Sorry about the odd delay with things like votes and stuff coming in. That's one of the prices you pay for these kind of remote sessions. But thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. Now, we'll email you a feedback form. It'd be really good to hear your views, both good and bad, please, because as long as they're honest, we can learn from them, and I'm sure they will be honest. A couple of other things to say. There's a number of questions, obviously, we didn't get a chance to answer. We've got a record of them, and we will endeavour to answer them outside the meeting. We'll send you an email, a letter, whatever's the most convenient way of doing that. So please give us a little time, but we will do that. And finally, just to say that the new strategy I talked about is on our website. It's a downloadable form at the moment, but we're working on a new, improved, better illustrated version, print-friendly format too, and that will be ready very shortly, and you'll hear from us as soon as it is. But thank you all so much for coming. I hope to see you all at the very latest 12 months' time from here, and hopefully not virtually, but hopefully a lot before that, sooner than that. Take care. Thank you.